Is this a religious war, or is religion merely a veil, something draped over deeper ambitions, something that makes power easier to justify and conflict easier to accept? At first glance, the war between Russia and Ukraine appears to be a modern geopolitical struggle, shaped by alliances, borders, and strategic interests. But the longer you sit with it, the more it begins to feel like something older, something rooted in centuries of shared memory, fractured identity, and contested belief. Before we go deeper, consider subscribing and following the channel if you want more analyses like this, stories that don't just explain events, but uncover the deeper forces behind them. To understand this conflict, you have to begin with a paradox. Russia and Ukraine are not strangers to each other. They are, in many ways, branches of the same historical tree. They share linguistic ties, overlapping cultural traditions, and most importantly, a common religious heritage shaped by Eastern Orthodox Christianity. For centuries, their identities were intertwined, not clearly separated. This shared origin is precisely what makes the conflict so complex. It is not simply a clash between two unrelated nations. It is a fracture within something that was once perceived as whole. And when a shared past is broken, the question is never just about territory. It becomes something deeper. Who owns the story? Whose version of history is legitimate? And perhaps most unsettling of all, whose faith is the true continuation of that past? That question, whose faith, sits quietly beneath the surface of political speeches and military strategies. Because when leaders speak of protecting people, traditions, or heritage, they are often invoking something more than policy. They are invoking identity, and identity, in this region, is inseparable from religion. But this is where the narrative becomes complicated. Despite the frequent references to faith, this is not a religious war in the traditional sense. There is no direct confrontation between entirely different belief systems. There is no declared holy war, no clear call to defend one theology against another. Instead, both sides emerge from the same religious framework, the same spiritual lineage. The divide is not between religions, but within one. And yet, religion refuses to remain silent. It appears repeatedly in public discourse, woven into the language of justification. It becomes a subtle but powerful tool. When political objectives are framed in terms of protecting faith, defending sacred traditions, or preserving a spiritual legacy, they gain a different kind of weight. They begin to feel less like choices and more like obligations. This is how legitimacy is constructed, not only through law or diplomacy, but through belief. Because belief does something politics alone cannot do. It reaches into emotion, into identity, into the deepest layers of how people understand themselves and their place in the world. To see how this dynamic developed, you have to step back, far beyond the present conflict, into the structure of the religious world itself. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, which shapes both Russian and Ukrainian spiritual life, operates very differently from centralized religious systems. There is no single, unquestioned authority, no equivalent of a supreme figure whose decision ends all debate. Instead, it is a network, multiple churches, each with its own leadership, traditions, and autonomy, yet connected by shared belief. At first glance, this seems like a strength. It allows diversity, local identity, and flexibility, but it also creates a vulnerability. When disagreements arise, there is no final arbiter, no one voice that can definitively say what is right or wrong for all. Over time, this structural ambiguity has allowed tensions to accumulate. Differences in interpretation, authority, and influence do not disappear. They linger, unresolved, beneath the surface. And when historical pressures intensify, those hidden fractures can re-emerge with surprising force. This is exactly what began to happen in the modern era, particularly as Ukraine sought to redefine itself, not just politically but spiritually. The desire for an independent national identity naturally extended into the religious sphere. If a nation is sovereign, should its faith institutions also be sovereign? Should they remain tied to a historical center that now belongs to another state? These questions came to a turning point in recent years when Ukraine moved toward establishing a more independent religious structure. The implications were profound. This was not just an administrative change within a church. It was a symbolic act, a declaration that identity, both national and spiritual, could no longer be defined externally. For many in Ukraine, it represented a long-awaited step towards self-definition. But from the perspective of Russia, it was perceived very differently, not as independence, but as fragmentation, not as evolution, but as loss. Because when a shared religious space begins to divide, it is not only institutions that are affected, it is the sense of historical continuity itself. And so, what might appear on the surface as a political dispute begins to take on deeper meaning. Religion, in this context, does not act as the original cause of conflict. It does not ignite the war. But it shapes how the war is understood, how it is justified, and how it is sustained. It provides language, symbolism, and emotional resonance. It transforms strategic decisions into moral narratives. It gives people a framework through which sacrifice can be interpreted not just as necessary, but as meaningful. This is why the question from the beginning remains so difficult to answer. Is this a religious war? Not in the conventional sense. There are no opposing religions fighting for dominance. But to say that religion is irrelevant would be equally misleading. It is present, quietly but persistently, beneath the surface. It amplifies identity, reinforces divisions, and adds a layer of meaning that makes compromise more difficult. Because when conflict is tied to belief, it is no longer just about what is gained or lost in material terms. It becomes about what is right, what is sacred, and what must be defended at all costs. And perhaps that is the most unsettling realization of all. Some wars are fought over land, others over power. But the most enduring conflicts are often those that unfold within shared histories and shared beliefs, where the line between us and them is not clearly drawn, but painfully constructed over time. In such conflicts, the battlefield is not only physical, it exists in memory, in identity, and in the stories people tell themselves about who they are and where they come from. What begins to emerge, once the surface layers are stripped away, is not simply a conflict over land or influence, but a struggle over identity itself. And identity, in this case, is not abstract. It is lived, remembered, and deeply tied to how a nation understands its past and imagines its future. Nowhere is this more visible than in the diverging paths of Ukraine and Russia. For Ukraine, the conflict has increasingly become a process of separation, not only territorial or political, but existential. Over the past decades, especially after key turning points in the 21st century, Ukraine has moved with growing determination to define itself on its own terms. This is not merely about governance or international alignment, it is about answering a deeper question. Who are we, if not an extension of someone else's history? To answer that question, Ukraine has had to revisit and, in some cases, rewrite the narratives that once tied it closely to Russia. Cultural expressions, language policies, historical commemorations, and religious affiliations have all become part of this broader effort. The goal is not simply independence in a legal sense, but independence in meaning, in the symbolic architecture that defines a nation's identity. In this process, even elements that once seemed shared or inseparable are being re-evaluated. What was once seen as common heritage is now examined through the lens of sovereignty. But identity is rarely something that can be redefined without resistance, especially when it overlaps so heavily with the identity of another power. From the perspective of Russia, Ukraine's movement away is not interpreted as a neutral act of self-definition. Instead, it is often seen as a rupture, an unnatural break from a historical continuum that, in Russian narratives, was never meant to be divided. The idea of a shared origin, particularly rooted in early medieval history, and the formation of Eastern Slavic civilization, plays a central role here. Within this framework, Ukraine is not simply a neighboring country, it is part of a broader civilizational space, a space that is cultural, historical, and spiritual at once. This concept is sometimes described, implicitly or explicitly, as a historical space, where borders are less important than continuity. In such a worldview, separation is not just political divergence, it is fragmentation. And fragmentation carries emotional and symbolic weight. It suggests loss, not only of territory, but of identity coherence. This is why actions taken by Ukraine to assert independence, especially in areas like religion or language, can be perceived in Russia not merely as policy decisions, but as challenges to a shared legacy. At this point, the conflict becomes more than strategic, it becomes narrative-driven. Two different stories are being told about the same past. One emphasizes continuity, unity, and shared destiny. The other emphasizes distinction, autonomy, and self-definition. And because both stories draw from overlapping historical realities, neither can be easily dismissed. This is what makes the conflict so difficult to resolve. It is not just about reconciling interests, but about reconciling interpretations of history, something far more resistant to compromise. To fully understand why these interpretations diverge so sharply, it is necessary to go even further back, beyond modern nationalism, into the deeper historical structures that shaped the religious and cultural world of the region. One of the most pivotal moments in this regard is the Great Schism, a rupture that fundamentally altered the organization of Christianity and, by extension, the development of European and Eurasian identities. The Great Schism divided Christianity into two major branches, the Western Church, centered in Rome, and the Eastern Church, which evolved into what we now call Eastern Orthodoxy. But the division was not merely theological, it was structural. In the West, the Roman Catholic model developed around a centralized authority, the Pope, whose role as the ultimate arbiter of doctrine and governance provided a clear, unified hierarchy. Decisions could be made, disputes could be settled, and authority could be traced back to a single point. In contrast, the Eastern Orthodox world developed along a very different path. Rather than a single central authority, it became a communion of multiple autocephalous churches, independent yet interconnected. Each church governs itself, maintains its own traditions, and exercises authority within its own jurisdiction. They are united by shared theology and liturgy, but not by a single governing figure. On paper, this model allows for flexibility, diversity, and local expression. It avoids the concentration of power and reflects a more distributed form of spiritual authority. However, this decentralization also introduces a fundamental challenge. When disagreements arise over doctrine, jurisdiction, or recognition, there is no final authority to resolve them universally. No single voice can definitively impose unity. Instead, disputes can persist, sometimes indefinitely, with each side appealing to its own interpretation of tradition, history, and legitimacy. Over time, this creates a landscape where unity is maintained not by enforcement, but by consensus, and where the breakdown of consensus can lead to fragmentation. This structural reality becomes especially significant in moments of political transformation. When a nation like Ukraine seeks to establish not only political independence but also religious autonomy, the question is no longer just internal. It affects the entire network of Orthodox churches. Who has the authority to recognize a new church? On what basis is legitimacy granted? And what happens when that recognition is contested? Without a central authority to provide definitive answers, these questions become sources of tension. Different churches may take different positions, alliances may shift. What might appear to outsiders as a purely religious dispute is, in fact, deeply entangled with questions of influence, jurisdiction, and historical interpretation. And because these questions cannot be easily resolved through a single decision, they tend to escalate rather than dissipate. In this context, the legacy of the Great Schism is not just a distant historical event. It is an active framework that continues to shape how religious authority operates in the present. The absence of a centralized structure does not eliminate conflict, it redistributes it. It allows multiple centers of authority to exist simultaneously, each with its own claims to legitimacy. And when these claims intersect with national identity and geopolitical ambition, the result is a complex web of tensions that extend far beyond the boundaries of theology. This is why the current conflict cannot be understood solely through the lens of modern politics. It is layered, historically, culturally, and spiritually. The divisions we see today are not new. They are the continuation of patterns that have evolved over centuries. What changes is not the existence of these tensions, but the context in which they are expressed. And in moments of crisis, those long-standing structures, especially ones as foundational as religious organization, can become catalysts, amplifying differences that might otherwise remain contained. So when we return to the present and to the ongoing struggle between Ukraine and Russia, we are not looking at a conflict that emerged suddenly. We are looking at the convergence of identity, history, and institutional structure, each reinforcing the other, each making resolution more complex. And at the center of it all lies a simple but powerful reality. When there is no single authority to define unity, unity itself becomes something that must constantly be negotiated, and sometimes, inevitably, broken. If the earlier layers of this story were shaped by centuries of gradual divergence, then the year 2019 stands out as something different, a moment when slow tension crystallized into a visible break. It was not the beginning of the conflict, but it marked a turning point where underlying fractures became undeniable. What had long existed as ambiguity within the Orthodox world suddenly took on a sharper, more decisive form. In that year, Ukraine moved closer to something it had been seeking for a long time, a recognized, independent Orthodox Church. The decision, formalized through recognition by Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, granted legitimacy to a religious structure that was no longer subordinated to Moscow's ecclesiastical authority. On the surface, this might appear to be a matter internal to religious administration, an issue of jurisdiction, organization, and governance within the Orthodox communion. But in reality, its significance extended far beyond theology. For many in Ukraine, this was not simply a religious milestone, it was a declaration, quiet in tone, but profound in implication. It signaled that Ukraine was no longer willing to define its spiritual life through institutions historically tied to Russia. In other words, independence was no longer limited to borders or political systems. It now extended into the realm of belief, into the structures that shape meaning and identity at the deepest level. This is why the event carries such symbolic weight. A nation may achieve political sovereignty, but as long as its cultural and spiritual institutions remain externally aligned, that sovereignty can feel incomplete. By establishing an independent church, Ukraine was, in effect, asserting the right to define not only its present, but its past and its values. It was saying, we are not merely a branch of a larger historical narrative, we are a distinct story in our own right. But if this moment represented affirmation for Ukraine, it represented something else entirely for Russia. From Moscow's perspective, the recognition of an independent Ukrainian church was not a neutral or purely religious development. It was seen as an intrusion into a shared spiritual space, a space that had long been considered part of a unified Orthodox tradition under significant Russian influence. The reaction was swift and consequential. The Russian Orthodox Church responded by severing communion with Constantinople, a move that carries deep meaning within the Orthodox world. To cut communion is not merely to disagree. It is to acknowledge that unity has broken down at a fundamental level. It means that shared rituals, mutual recognition, and spiritual fellowship are no longer intact. In practical terms, it creates a division within the broader Orthodox community. But symbolically, it signals something even more significant. that the dispute is no longer manageable within existing structures. It has crossed a threshold. What makes this moment particularly important is that it reveals how closely intertwined religion and sovereignty have become in this context. The dispute is not only about who has the authority to grant recognition, but about what that recognition represents. For Ukraine, it is an affirmation of independence. For Russia, it is a challenge to continuity. And because both interpretations are rooted in deeply held beliefs, historical, cultural, and spiritual, they are not easily reconciled. This is why the events of 2019 cannot be understood as a purely religious controversy. They function as a kind of point of rupture where multiple layers, identity, authority, and history intersect. It is a moment where the abstract becomes concrete, where long-standing tensions take institutional form. And once that happens, the possibility of returning to a previous state of ambiguity becomes increasingly unlikely. The line has been drawn. From this point forward, the conflict no longer unfolds along a single axis. Instead, it begins to reflect multiple, overlapping perspectives, each shaped by a different understanding of what religion should represent in times of crisis. What emerges is not one unified religious stance, but several distinct positions, each drawing from the same faith, yet arriving at very different conclusions. On one side, there is a perspective closely aligned with the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. Within this framework, religion is often articulated in terms of preservation, of tradition, of cultural continuity, of a moral and spiritual order that is perceived to be under threat. The language used emphasizes protection, protecting believers, protecting heritage, protecting a way of life. When framed in this way, political actions can be interpreted as necessary measures to defend something sacred. The boundary between civic duty and spiritual obligation begins to blur. What might otherwise be seen as strategic decisions are elevated into acts of responsibility, even of faith. On the other side, within Ukraine, a different emphasis emerges. Here, religious discourse tends to focus more explicitly on peace, human dignity, and resistance to violence. The same underlying faith becomes a source of ethical reflection rather than justification. Religious leaders and institutions in this context often frame the conflict in moral terms, not as a duty to defend tradition through force, but as a call to protect life and uphold compassion. In this interpretation, faith acts as a constraint, setting limits on what can be justified, rather than expanding the scope of acceptable action. Between these two positions stands a third voice, that of Constantinople. While it does not possess centralized authority over all Orthodox churches, its historical and symbolic significance grants it considerable influence. In recognizing the independence of the Ukrainian Church, Constantinople effectively aligned itself with the principle of ecclesiastical self-determination. At the same time, it has consistently called for de-escalation and an end to conflict. Its stance reflects an attempt to navigate between tradition and change, between preserving unity and acknowledging the reality of division. What is striking about these three positions is not simply that they differ, but that they all emerge from the same religious foundation. There is no doctrinal split equivalent to that of entirely separate religions. The core beliefs, rituals, and theological frameworks remain largely shared. And yet, from that shared base, three distinct interpretations arise, each shaping how the conflict is understood and how it is acted upon. This reveals something fundamental about the nature of religion in complex geopolitical contexts. Religion is not a fixed set of instructions that produces identical outcomes. It is a system of meaning, one that must be interpreted, applied, and lived within specific historical and social conditions. As those conditions change, so too does the way religion is understood. The same symbols can be used to justify action or to restrain it. The same narratives can inspire unity or deepen division. In this sense, the phrase "one faith, three interpretations" is not merely descriptive, it is diagnostic. It helps explain why the conflict resists simple categorization. It is not a battle between belief and disbelief, nor between entirely different religions. It is a divergence within a shared framework, amplified by political, historical, and cultural forces. And once again, this brings us back to the central tension running through the entire story. If religion can be interpreted in such different ways, then its role in conflict cannot be reduced to cause or effect. It operates somewhere in between, as a medium through which deeper forces are expressed. It shapes perception, reinforces identity, and provides language for actions that might otherwise seem purely strategic. By the time we reach this stage of the narrative, the picture is no longer one of a single conflict with a clear origin. It is a layered structure where each level, history, identity, religion, and power, interacts with the others. The events of 2019 did not create this structure, but they exposed it. They revealed how fragile unity can be when it depends on interpretation rather than authority. And they showed that when those interpretations diverge far enough, even a shared faith may not be enough to hold a community together. As the conflict deepens, it becomes increasingly clear that religion does not operate here as a passive background element. It is active, adaptive, and at times instrumental. Not in the sense that belief itself is inherently manipulative, but in the way it can be positioned, framed, and mobilized within a broader narrative. In moments of crisis, religion can take on roles that extend far beyond personal faith. It becomes language, justification, motivation, and even a lens through which reality is interpreted. One of the most powerful roles it plays is in the legitimization of conflict. When political or military actions are described using purely strategic terms, they remain open to debate. People can question their necessity, their consequences, and their moral cost. But when those same actions are framed as a defense of faith, tradition, or sacred heritage, the conversation changes. The argument shifts from, "Is this beneficial?" to, "Is this right?" And once an action is perceived as morally or spiritually justified, opposing it becomes far more difficult, not because it is logically unassailable, but because it is emotionally and symbolically reinforced. In this way, religion does not create the objective of the conflict, but it strengthens the narrative around it. It provides a vocabulary that elevates political aims into something more enduring, more meaningful. Words like protection, heritage, and sacred duty carry weight that goes beyond policy. They resonate with identity, and when identity is engaged, people are more likely to accept hardship, to endure loss, and to commit themselves to a cause with greater intensity. This leads directly into a second function: religion as a source of psychological endurance. War, by its nature, is destabilizing. It disrupts normal life, introduces uncertainty, and forces individuals into situations that challenge both physical and emotional limits. In such conditions, belief can become a stabilizing force. It offers a framework through which suffering can be understood, not as random or meaningless, but as part of a larger purpose. When individuals believe that their actions are aligned with something greater than themselves, whether that is divine will, moral truth, or historical destiny, they are able to withstand pressures that might otherwise be overwhelming. Fear becomes more manageable, sacrifice becomes more acceptable, and perseverance becomes not just possible, but necessary. This is not unique to any one side of the conflict. It is a broader human pattern. But in a situation where both sides draw from similar religious traditions, the effect is amplified. Each can see itself as justified, each can find meaning in its struggle, and each can continue with a sense of conviction that is difficult to erode. There is a stark reality embedded in this dynamic. Those who believe they are supported by something sacred often fight with greater intensity, not because they are inherently more aggressive, but because their actions are framed as obligation rather than choice. And when war becomes an obligation, it is far harder to bring it to an end. negotiation begins to feel like compromise, and compromise begins to feel like betrayal, not just of political interests, but of something more profound. Beyond legitimization and motivation, religion also shapes perception. It influences how events are interpreted, how narratives are constructed, and how communities understand their place within the conflict. This is perhaps its most subtle, yet most pervasive role, because perception determines not only what people believe, but how they respond to what they believe. In this context, historical events are not simply remembered, they are retold, reframed, and integrated into a broader narrative that supports present-day positions. Religious symbolism often plays a central role in this process, linking contemporary actions to a deeper sense of continuity. What is happening now is not seen as isolated, but as part of an ongoing story, one that began long before the current generation and will continue beyond it. This brings us to one of the most symbolically charged elements of the entire conflict: Crimea. At a glance, Crimea is a peninsula of strategic importance. Its location on the Black Sea makes it a critical point for military positioning, naval access, and regional influence. From a geopolitical perspective, control over Crimea offers tangible advantages: control over trade routes, defensive capabilities, and projection of power. These are measurable, concrete factors that fit within the conventional logic of statecraft. But to view Crimea solely through this lens is to miss a crucial dimension. Because Crimea is not just a strategic asset, it is a symbol. And like all powerful symbols, its meaning is layered. It carries with it historical narratives, cultural associations, and, importantly, religious significance. Within certain historical traditions, Crimea is linked to early moments in the Christianization of the Eastern Slavic world. It is associated with foundational events that are interpreted as marking the spiritual beginnings of a civilization. Whether these narratives are interpreted in strictly historical terms or as symbolic constructs is, in some ways, secondary. What matters is the role they play in shaping perception. When a place is associated with origins, when it is seen as the site where identity itself began, it acquires a different kind of importance. It is no longer just land, it becomes memory. And memory, especially collective memory, is not easily negotiated. This is why the dispute over Crimea extends beyond questions of legal sovereignty or military control. It is also a dispute over meaning. For one side, it represents a continuation of historical and spiritual heritage. For the other, it represents territorial integrity and the principles of modern statehood. These perspectives are not simply contradictory, they operate on different levels. One is rooted in narrative continuity, the other in contemporary political order. And because they draw from different frameworks, they are difficult to reconcile. In this sense, the conflict over Crimea can be understood as a contest over memory. Not memory in the personal sense, but in the collective sense, the shared stories that define a community's identity. These stories are not static, they are shaped, repeated, and sometimes contested. And when two communities attach different meanings to the same place, that place becomes a focal point of tension. The phrase, "who controls the past controls the present," captures this dynamic with unsettling precision. Because control over historical narrative influences how current actions are perceived. If one narrative becomes dominant, it can frame those actions as justified, necessary, even inevitable. And when that framing is reinforced by religious symbolism, its impact becomes even stronger. What makes this situation particularly complex is that there is no single, universally accepted version of the past. Multiple narratives exist, each supported by different interpretations, experiences, and priorities. These narratives do not simply coexist, they compete. And in times of conflict, that competition intensifies. Each side seeks to reinforce its version, not only through argument, but through repetition, through cultural expression, and through alignment with broader systems of belief. As a result, the conflict becomes not only a struggle over territory or influence, but over interpretation itself. It is about who has the authority to define what a place means, what history signifies, and how identity should be understood. And when these questions intersect with religion, they gain an additional layer of depth. Because religion does not just inform belief, it anchors it. It connects it to something perceived as enduring and unchanging. At this stage, the conflict can no longer be described in simple terms. It is not reducible to politics, nor to religion, nor to history alone. It is the convergence of all three, each reinforcing the other. Religion legitimizes, motivates, and frames perception. History provides narrative and continuity. Geography offers the physical space where these forces collide. And within that space, places like Crimea become more than strategic assets. They become symbols of identity, carriers of memory, and focal points of a conflict that extends far beyond their borders. This is why resolution remains so elusive. Because what is being contested is not only what exists in the present, but how the past is understood and how the future is imagined. And as long as those interpretations remain fundamentally different, the conflict will continue to operate on multiple levels, visible and invisible, material and symbolic, strategic and deeply human. By this stage of the story, the conflict can no longer be understood as a sequence of isolated events. It reveals itself instead as something more subtle and enduring, a war not only of armies and territories, but of narratives, a war of stories. Because behind every action, every justification, every sacrifice, there is a version of the past being told, repeated, and reinforced. And in conflicts like this, the struggle over which story prevails can be just as decisive as any battle on the ground. The idea that who controls history controls belief is not simply rhetorical. It reflects a deeper mechanism through which societies organize meaning. History, in this sense, is not just a record of what happened. It is a framework through which people interpret who they are, where they come from, and what they are entitled to defend. When a particular version of history becomes dominant, it shapes perception in powerful ways. It influences how present actions are judged, whether they are seen as justified, necessary, or even inevitable. In the case of Russia and Ukraine, this dynamic is especially pronounced because the histories involved are not entirely separate. They overlap, intersect, and at times contradict each other. Both sides draw from shared origins, shared events, and shared cultural foundations. Yet from those same elements, they construct different narratives, each emphasizing certain moments while interpreting others in contrasting ways. One narrative may focus on continuity, on the idea of a unified historical space that has evolved over centuries. Another may emphasize rupture, highlighting moments of independence, resistance, and self-definition. Neither narrative is entirely fabricated. Both are grounded in real historical experiences. But the selection, emphasis, and interpretation of those experiences differ, and those differences matter because they determine how each side understands legitimacy, not only in the present, but across time. This coexistence of multiple historical narratives creates a kind of tension that cannot be easily resolved. It is not simply a matter of one side being correct and the other mistaken. It is a matter of perspective, of which elements are considered central, which are considered peripheral, and how they are connected into a coherent story. In peaceful times, such differences might remain part of academic debate or cultural discourse, but in times of conflict, they become more than intellectual disagreements. They become foundations for action. When a community believes that its version of history is not only valid but essential to its identity, defending that narrative becomes a priority. And when that narrative is challenged, whether by external forces or by alternative interpretations, it can be perceived as a threat, not just to knowledge, but to existence. Because if the story that defines who you are is undermined, then your sense of self becomes unstable. This is why narrative conflicts can be so intense. They operate at the level of identity, not just information. In this environment, religion and history often reinforce each other. Religious symbols, traditions, and institutions can anchor historical narratives, giving them a sense of permanence and authority. At the same time, historical narratives can provide context and meaning to religious identity, linking belief to a broader sense of destiny or continuity. The result is a powerful combination, one that shapes not only how people think, but how they feel and act. This brings us to the broader conclusion that emerges from the entire analysis. Despite the frequent references to faith, this is not a religious war in the traditional sense. There is no direct confrontation between entirely separate religions, no clear doctrinal battle that defines the conflict. The core beliefs involved are, in many respects, shared. The divisions arise not from opposing theologies, but from differing interpretations, affiliations, and applications within a common framework. At the same time, it would be inaccurate to say that religion is irrelevant. Its role is significant, but not primary. It acts as a catalyst, a force that amplifies existing tensions rather than creating them from nothing. It provides language, symbolism, and emotional resonance. It helps transform political and historical disputes into matters of moral significance. And once that transformation occurs, the conflict takes on a different character. It becomes more resistant to compromise, more deeply rooted in identity, and more difficult to resolve. If we look beneath these layers, the underlying drivers of the conflict become clearer. At its core, this is a struggle shaped by power, by the desire to influence, to control, to define the boundaries of authority. It is shaped by identity, by the need of communities to understand themselves as distinct, coherent, and legitimate. And it is shaped by history, not just as a sequence of events, but as a source of meaning that informs both power and identity. These three elements, power, identity, and history, do not operate independently. They reinforce each other. Power seeks justification through history. Identity is constructed through both power and history is interpreted in ways that support existing identities and power structures. Religion intersects with all three, not as a separate domain, but as a medium through which they are expressed and intensified. Understanding this interconnected structure does not provide an easy solution to the conflict, but it does offer a clearer way of seeing it. It allows us to move beyond simplified explanations and recognize the complexity involved. And perhaps more importantly, it highlights the importance of critical awareness, of the ability to question how narratives are constructed and how beliefs are mobilized. This leads to the final reflection, which is less about the conflict itself and more about how we, as observers, engage with it. In a world where information is constantly presented, repeated, and framed in particular ways, it becomes essential to maintain a certain distance, a capacity to analyze rather than simply absorb, especially when it comes to matters of faith. Belief, by its nature, is powerful. It shapes values, guides behavior, and provides meaning. But precisely because of its power, it can also be used, intentionally or unintentionally, to support objectives that extend beyond its original purpose. This does not diminish the value of faith. It simply underscores the need to approach it with awareness, to recognize when it is being expressed as genuine conviction and when it is being positioned as part of a larger narrative. Equally important is the distinction between religion and politics. The two can intersect, and often do, but they are not identical. When religious language appears within political contexts, it is worth asking, what role is it playing? Is it guiding ethical reflection, or is it reinforcing a particular agenda? Is it inviting understanding, or encouraging division? These questions do not have simple answers, but asking them is essential. Finally, there is the role of history. To understand the past is not to be bound by it, but to gain clarity about the present. When we recognize that historical narratives can be shaped, emphasized, or reinterpreted, we become less susceptible to being guided by them unconsciously. We begin to see that what is presented as inevitable may, in fact, be constructed. And in that recognition, there is a degree of freedom, the ability to think critically, to question, and to engage with complexity rather than avoid it. In the end, the conflict we have examined is not only a geopolitical event, it is a reflection of how deeply intertwined belief, identity, and narrative can become. It shows how history can live on, not just in records, but in the way people understand themselves and others. And it reminds us that while wars may be fought on physical terrain, their roots often lie in something far less visible, within the stories we inherit, the meanings we assign, and the beliefs we choose to uphold.